January 1945. The air above the battlefield hung heavy with wet smoke and pulverized earth. Somewhere near the German frontier, American artillery continued to hammer a line of reinforced bunkers hidden beneath shattered trees and frozen mud. The ground shook in slow rhythm. Snowmelt dripped into shell craters already darkened with blood and oil. Inside one of those bunkers, German soldiers waited behind concrete walls nearly a meter thick. A machine gun covered the open approach. Every American squad that moved toward it had been forced back. Then, a young U.S. Marine began advancing alone through the smoke. He was barely older than a teenager. Mud covered his uniform. Rifle fire snapped past him as he crawled toward the bunker entrance, carrying grenades and demolition charges. The German defenders could hear him getting closer, and within minutes, men who had trusted the bunker to keep them alive were abandoning it in fear. The battle surrounding that bunker had already become brutal, but what happened next would reveal how quickly discipline could collapse when fear entered confined spaces designed for survival. By the winter of 1944 and early 1945, the Second World War had entered one of its most destructive final phases. Across Europe, Allied armies were pushing steadily toward the German homeland. Cities lay in ruins beneath constant bombing campaigns. Rail lines had been shattered. Fuel shortages crippled German mobility. Yet, despite the growing collapse of the Reich, German resistance on the battlefield often became more dangerous as defeat drew closer. The German army had spent years perfecting defensive warfare, concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun positions, hidden artillery observation posts, trenches protected by mines and barbed wire. Entire defensive sectors were designed not simply to stop enemy infantry, but to break their momentum psychologically. Every approach toward a bunker exposed attacking soldiers to overlapping fire. Even heavily armed Allied units could lose dozens of men trying to capture a single fortified position. For infantrymen, bunker warfare became one of the most feared forms of combat in the entire war. Unlike open-field fighting, there was rarely room to maneuver. Attackers had to move directly toward heavily defended openings while under concentrated fire. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades, and close-range rifle assaults became necessary tools. Battles often ended only when one side was physically incapable of continuing. American units advancing through German-held territory quickly learned that even isolated bunkers could delay entire offensives for hours or days. A single machine gun nest hidden beneath reinforced concrete could pin down platoons across open ground. Mortar crews targeted anyone attempting to flank the position. Snipers waited for medics and radio operators. In forests and ruined villages, visibility collapsed into smoke, dust, and sudden bursts of violence. And by 1945, many German defenders understood there was nowhere left to retreat. Orders increasingly emphasized holding positions at all costs. Some garrisons fought until ammunition was exhausted. Others collapsed only after direct close-quarters assaults forced soldiers into panic inside their own defensive shelters. It was inside this atmosphere of exhaustion, fear, and collapsing front lines that one young Marine and his unit approached a heavily fortified German position that had already stalled multiple advances. Ahead of them, hidden behind mud, timber, and reinforced concrete, a bunker waited in silence. The young Marine moving toward that bunker was not a hardened veteran shaped by years of war. Like thousands of American servicemen arriving in Europe during the final stages of World War II, he had entered combat at an age when most young men were still trying to understand adulthood itself. Many Marines and infantry soldiers fighting in the war's final campaigns were barely 19 or 20 years old. Some looked even younger beneath oversized helmets and mud-stained uniforms. Training had prepared them for weapons, formations, and battlefield drills. It could not fully prepare them for bunker warfare. Combat against fortified positions demanded a different kind of courage. Men had to advance toward enemy fire while knowing there was often no cover between themselves and the machine guns waiting ahead. Every step forward could be the last one. Yet hesitation could trap entire units in exposed terrain where casualties mounted rapidly. The battlefield surrounding the bunker had already become a killing ground. American forces attempting to move through the sector found themselves pinned by accurate German fire coming from concealed defensive positions. Machine guns swept the open approaches. Mortar rounds burst through the trees overhead, scattering splinters of frozen wood and steel fragments across the ground. Telephone lines between units were repeatedly severed by shellfire. Communication became unreliable. Officers struggled to coordinate movement through smoke and confusion. The weather only deepened the misery. Cold rain and melting snow turned the earth into heavy mud that clung to boots and equipment. Wounded men often remained exposed for long periods because stretcher teams could not safely reach them under fire. Supplies moved slowly. Fatigue spread through the ranks. Somewhere ahead, hidden beneath camouflage netting and reinforced earth, the bunker remained active. Each time American troops attempted to advance, the position erupted with automatic fire. The defenders inside understood their field of fire perfectly. They had elevation, protection, and narrow firing slits that made return fire difficult. The bunker had effectively locked down the surrounding terrain. For the Marine unit facing it, the position was becoming more than a tactical obstacle. It was becoming a psychological barrier. Every minute the bunker survived, confidence weakened. Men stayed pinned behind shallow cover, listening to bullets crack overhead while waiting for orders that might send them directly into concentrated fire. Then, amid the smoke and collapsing noise of the battlefield, one young Marine prepared to move closer than anyone else had managed to reach, and inside the bunker, German soldiers continued waiting behind concrete walls they believed could still protect them from the chaos outside. From the outside, a German bunker appeared almost impossible to intimidate. Concrete walls absorbed artillery fragments. Thick earth coverings concealed positions from aircraft and long-range guns. Narrow firing slits gave defenders protection while exposing attackers to devastating machine gun fire. On paper, bunkers represented security and control. But inside, the experience could become terrifying. Most wartime bunkers were cramped, dark, and poorly ventilated. Gunpowder smoke lingered in enclosed air. Explosions outside shook dust from ceilings and rattled metal equipment against concrete walls. During sustained assaults, defenders often had limited information about what was happening beyond the firing slits. That uncertainty created fear. If attackers reached the entrance, the bunker could quickly become a trap instead of a fortress. Flamethrowers forced oxygen from enclosed rooms. Grenades bounced unpredictably through corridors. Satchel charges collapsed walls and entrances. Soldiers inside understood that once close-quarters combat began, escape routes disappeared quickly. Veterans from both Allied and German forces later described bunker fighting as some of the most psychologically exhausting combat of the war. The danger was no longer distant artillery or rifle fire from hundreds of meters away. It became immediate, personal, and impossible to avoid. And as the young Marine moved closer through the smoke, the German defenders inside the bunker began, hearing sounds that artillery could not create. Footsteps, voices, metal, striking concrete near the entrance. The image of World War II soldiers is often shaped by hardened veterans with years of battlefield experience. In reality, many frontline troops were astonishingly young. By the later years of the war, Casualties had forced armies to continuously replace experienced men with new recruits. American Marines and infantrymen arriving in combat zones often entered battle only months after training. Some had never fired their weapons outside practice ranges before, facing machine guns and artillery. Youth created contradictions on the battlefield. Younger soldiers sometimes reacted with extreme fear during first combat encounters. Others displayed reckless aggression that older veterans considered dangerous. Many had not yet developed the instinctive caution that prolonged warfare created. In bunker assaults, that aggression could become decisive. Taking fortified positions required soldiers willing to move forward despite overwhelming danger. Hesitation allowed defenders to recover and reorganize. Momentum mattered. A few seconds of pressure at the entrance of a bunker could determine whether defenders held their ground or collapsed psychologically. The Marine approaching the German position carried that same mixture of fear, adrenaline, and determination shared by countless young servicemen during the war's final campaigns. Around him, experienced men remained pinned by enemy fire. Ahead of him, the bunker still dominated the battlefield, and the distance between the two continued shrinking. Attacking. A bunker was rarely clean or organized. Battle plans often collapsed within minutes of first contact. The standard method involved suppressing the bunker with machine guns, rifles, mortars, or artillery, while assault teams attempted to close the distance from the flanks. Engineers carrying explosives were especially important. Flamethrower operators, though feared by defenders, were also among the most vulnerable men on the battlefield because enemy fire focused heavily on them. But real combat rarely followed textbook procedures. Mud slowed movement. Smoke reduced visibility. Officers were killed or separated from units. Communication broke apart beneath artillery fire. In many cases, bunker assaults devolved into isolated acts of initiative by small groups or even individual soldiers. That was what made these battles so deadly. Attackers often had to crawl within meters of machine gun positions before using grenades or demolition charges. Casualty rates during such assaults could become catastrophic in only a few minutes. German defenders depended on maintaining fire superiority and emotional control. As long as they believed the bunker remained secure, they could hold off forces much larger than themselves. But once attackers breached that sense of security, discipline could disintegrate rapidly. And now, beneath smoke drifting across shattered ground, the young Marine had reached a distance where the defenders inside the bunker could no longer ignore him. By 1945, many German soldiers defending fortified positions understood the war was turning against them. Entire cities had already fallen. Allied bombers crossed German skies almost daily. On the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives were crushing defensive lines with overwhelming force. In the West, American and British armies continued advancing despite fierce resistance. Yet many bunker crews continued fighting with remarkable determination. Part of that discipline came from training. German defensive doctrine emphasized holding positions under extreme pressure. Soldiers defending bunkers were taught that abandoning fortified positions exposed nearby units and accelerated collapse across the front. A bunker was not simply a shelter. It was an anchor point holding entire defensive sectors together. But fear still existed beneath that. Discipline. Defenders trapped inside confined structures often had little understanding of how close enemy soldiers actually were. Noise distorted reality. Explosions shook walls constantly. Smoke entered ventilation systems. Telephone communications with nearby positions frequently failed during artillery bombardments. Under those conditions, imagination became dangerous. A single grenade near an entrance could sound like a full breach attempt. Footsteps overhead could convince defenders they were surrounded. If one soldier panicked, fear spread rapidly through enclosed spaces where everyone depended on each other for survival. And somewhere outside the bunker, moving through mud and gunfire, the young Marine continued closing the distance. World War II battlefield leadership often had little resemblance to carefully planned strategy maps shown in military briefings. In close combat, leadership became immediate and personal. Junior officers, sergeants, and even ordinary riflemen frequently made decisions that determined whether units survived or collapsed. Radio communication failed constantly. Smoke concealed movement. Entire squads became separated inside forests, ruined villages, and trench networks. Under those conditions, initiative mattered more than rank. Many successful assaults occurred because one soldier acted before others could fully process the situation. Aggressive movement created momentum. Momentum created confusion among defenders, and confusion could break defensive positions faster than artillery. Veterans repeatedly described how courage spread through units almost like a chain reaction. When one man advanced under fire, others often followed. But the opposite was equally true. If fear froze a unit in place, even superior numbers became meaningless against fortified defenses. The Marine approaching the bunker was operating inside that fragile balance between paralysis and momentum. Behind him, fellow Marines remained pinned by machine gun fire. Ahead of him, German defenders still believed the bunker entrance remained protected. The next few moments would test both assumptions at once. Close quarters fighting stripped away many illusions about war. At long range, soldiers often fired toward distant shapes, flashes, or movement across terrain they barely understood. Inside bunker assaults, combat became direct and intensely human. Men heard each other breathing, shouting and screaming through smoke-filled corridors only meters apart. Fear overpowered ideology quickly in those environments. Many German defenders had spent years surviving artillery barrages and open battlefield combat. But confined warfare created a different psychological pressure. Once attackers reached entrances or ventilation points, defenders understood that death could arrive within seconds and from any direction. Survival instincts began replacing military discipline. Historians studying bunker warfare repeatedly found examples where heavily fortified positions collapsed suddenly after defenders believed enemy troops had breached their perimeter. Sometimes the attackers were fewer in number than defenders expected. Sometimes confusion magnified the threat far beyond reality. The terror came not only from the possibility of death, but from the feeling of entrapment. And now that fear was beginning to spread inside the German bunker. Outside, the young Marine had reached the edge of the defensive position itself. Smoke drifted low across the shattered ground. Gunfire echoed through the trees. And somewhere inside the bunker, men who had trusted concrete walls for protection were beginning to wonder whether staying inside might be more dangerous than fleeing into open fire. The battlefield had narrowed into noise, smoke, and survival. German machine gun fire still swept across the open ground in short, violent bursts, forcing American Marines to remain low behind shell craters and shattered earth. Every attempt to rise drew immediate fire from the bunker's narrow firing slits. Mortar explosions continued hammering the surrounding area, throwing mud and splinters through the cold air. But somewhere within that chaos, the young Marine kept moving. He crawled forward through wet soil blackened by explosives, dragging grenades and demolition charges beside him. Bullets snapped overhead so closely that dirt sprayed across his helmet with every burst. Around him, other Marines attempted to maintain suppressive fire toward the bunker openings, trying to force the defenders to keep their heads down for only a few critical seconds. That was all an assault team ever needed. Inside the bunker, German soldiers could hear rifle fire striking concrete walls and steel supports. Dust drifted through the enclosed rooms each time artillery landed nearby. The defenders still controlled the battlefield outside, but visibility had collapsed beneath smoke and flying debris. Then came a sound much closer than expected. Metallic impact near the entrance. One of the Marines had reached the outer defensive edge. The bunker erupted with immediate reaction. Machine gun fire shifted violently toward the entrance area. Rifle shots cracked from secondary firing positions hidden nearby. German defenders understood exactly what was happening now. An American assault team was attempting to breach the bunker directly. The young Marine pressed himself against the concrete wall beside the entrance as gunfire tore across the position only feet away. Smoke from explosions drifted through the narrow approach corridor. He pulled a grenade free, waded through another burst of machine gun fire, and hurled it toward the bunker opening. The explosion detonated inside with crushing force. For a brief moment, firing from the bunker stopped. American Marines behind him immediately increased suppressive fire across the surrounding defenses. The pause created confusion. German soldiers inside the bunker struggled to determine whether attackers had already breached the interior or were preparing a larger assault outside. Then, another explosive landed near the entrance. Dust and smoke blasted outward, into the cold air. Inside the bunker, the psychological balance began shifting rapidly. The concrete walls still stood. The machine guns still functioned. But now the defenders could hear movement directly outside their position. And for soldiers trapped inside confined rooms beneath layers of earth and concrete, that realization could become more terrifying than artillery itself. The second explosion changed everything inside the bunker. Smoke rolled through the entrance passageway, mixing with dust shaken loose from the ceiling. Lights flickered. Men shouted over one another in cramped defensive chambers where clear communication had already begun collapsing beneath the noise of battle. The defenders still had weapons. They still had ammunition, but certainty was disappearing. From somewhere near the entrance came another burst of gunfire, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement against the outer wall. To the German soldiers inside, it no longer sounded like a distant assault. It sounded as if American troops were already surrounding the bunker itself. That fear spread fast. Bunker warfare depended heavily on psychological control. Defenders had to believe the structure around them remained secure. Once soldiers began imagining enemy troops entering ventilation shafts, throwing grenades through firing slits, or preparing flamethrowers outside the entrance, panic could overwhelm even disciplined units. The young Marine exploited that fear relentlessly. Pinned against the concrete wall beside the entrance, he continued throwing grenades toward openings and access points, while nearby Marines poured suppressive fire across the surrounding defenses. Each explosion echoed violently through the enclosed interior. The sound became magnified inside confined concrete chambers, making the assault feel larger than it truly was. Some German defenders attempted to continue firing through the bunker slits. Others began pulling back deeper into the interior passageways. Orders became difficult to hear. Dust filled the air. Men struggled to understand whether the entrance had already been breached. Then someone inside the bunker made the decision that changed the battle. Retreat. Not an organized withdrawal, a flight response. One after another, German soldiers began abandoning the bunker through secondary exits and escape routes, rushing into the open battlefield rather than remaining trapped inside the structure. Some attempted to flee toward nearby defensive positions. Others simply ran from the bunker itself, believing they were moments away from being sealed inside under explosives or fire. American Marines watching from forward positions could hardly believe what they were seeing. The bunker that had pinned down advancing troops and dominated the battlefield only minutes earlier was suddenly emptying under pressure from a close assault led by a single, determined Marine at its entrance. As German soldiers fled, American fire immediately struck the exposed defenders crossing open ground. Nearby resistance weakened almost instantly. Without the bunker anchoring the defensive line, surrounding German positions lost coordination and confidence. Within minutes, the position that had stalled the advance was effectively neutralized. The battlefield slowly settled into the grim silence that often followed close combat. Smoke drifted across shattered earth, spent shell casings lay scattered near the bunker entrance, and the young Marine, still covered in mud and dust from the assault, stood beside the concrete structure that German defenders had abandoned in fear only moments earlier. For the men who witnessed it, the event became more than a successful attack on a fortified position. It became proof of how quickly fear could reverse the balance of power in war, even inside structures designed to resist everything except panic itself. Once the bunker fell silent, the battlefield around it began changing almost immediately. For hours, the German position had controlled the surrounding terrain through overlapping machine gun fire and psychological pressure. American troops advancing through the sector had been forced into cover, unable to move without exposing themselves to deadly fire. Casualties had already mounted among assault teams attempting to approach the defenses. But with the bunker abandoned, the entire defensive balance shifted. American Marines quickly secured the position and searched its interior. The concrete structure showed clear signs of panic during the final moments of the assault. Ammunition boxes had been left open. Equipment lay scattered across narrow corridors coated in dust and smoke residue. Some weapons remained abandoned beside firing slits still pointed toward the battlefield outside. The defenders had left in haste. Nearby German positions, now exposed without the bunker supporting them, began losing coordination. Communication lines between defensive sectors had already been damaged by artillery and close combat. Once soldiers saw troops fleeing from what had appeared to be a secure, fortified position, confidence weakened rapidly across the area. For American forces, the capture of the bunker opened a path that had previously been locked down by concentrated fire. Infantry units moved forward through terrain that had been untouchable only minutes earlier. Medics reached wounded Marines trapped behind cover during the earlier fighting. Engineers advanced to clear mines and reinforce captured ground. Officers reorganized units while artillery shifted fire deeper into German-held territory. The psychological effect spread through both sides. Among the Marines, the assault became an immediate example of battlefield initiative under extreme pressure. Soldiers who had watched the young Marine approach the bunker understood how narrow the margin between success and disaster had been. A few seconds of hesitation could have ended the attack completely. Among German defenders nearby, the loss carried a different message. If one bunker could be breached through aggressive close assault, then no defensive position felt entirely secure anymore. And as the front continued shifting forward, reports of the attack began moving up the chain of command, turning a violent moment on a frozen battlefield into part of the larger story of the war's final advance into German defenses. In the months following the battle, stories like the assault on the bunker became woven into the larger memory of World War II's final campaigns. Military historians often focus on divisions, offensives, and political decisions measured across entire continents. But for the soldiers who fought on the ground, wars were frequently decided in much smaller spaces: a bridge crossing, a ruined farmhouse, a trench line, or a concrete bunker hidden beneath trees and mud. The Marines' assault represented that reality perfectly. By the final year of the war, Allied armies possessed overwhelming industrial strength and growing numerical advantages. Yet victory still depended on individual infantrymen willing to advance into positions where tanks, artillery, and air power could not fully solve the problem alone. Bunker warfare remained intensely personal. Historians, studying close combat operations in Europe, repeatedly found that fortified defenses often collapsed not because concrete failed, but because human endurance failed first. Fear, exhaustion, confusion, and isolation slowly weakened defenders until aggressive assaults shattered their confidence entirely. German military reports from late-war defensive battles frequently described units abandoning strongpoints after believing they were surrounded or about to be overrun. In many cases, attackers were fewer in number than defenders imagined. The psychological pressure of confined combat magnified every sound, explosion, and movement. For Allied troops, those assaults demanded extraordinary courage. Young Marines and soldiers carried flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades directly toward machine gun fire, because there was often no alternative. Casualty rates among assault teams remained extremely high throughout the war. Many never returned from attacks against fortified positions. The bunker captured by the young Marine eventually became just one position among thousands overtaken during the collapse of Nazi Germany's defenses. The battlefield itself would fade beneath reconstruction, weather, and time. But moments like that endured because they revealed something deeper about warfare. Technology, concrete, and weapons could strengthen a defensive line. They could delay armies and shape battlefields. Yet, inside every bunker, trench, or command post remained ordinary human beings, vulnerable to fear once survival itself felt uncertain. And by the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, more and more fortified positions across Europe began collapsing under that same pressure. World War II produced battlefields measured in millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and entire cities consumed by fire. But many of its most decisive moments unfolded in spaces no larger than a bunker corridor. Inside those confined structures, warfare became brutally simple. Concrete walls could stop bullets. Steel doors could resist explosions. Machine guns could dominate open ground. Yet none of those defenses could fully protect the human mind from fear once attackers reached the entrance itself. The young Marine who advanced toward the German bunker was not carrying enough firepower to destroy an army alone. What changed the battle was pressure, movement, determination under conditions where hesitation usually meant death. For the German defenders, the bunker had represented safety only as long as distance existed between themselves and the enemy outside. The moment that distance disappeared, the psychology of the battlefield changed completely. That pattern repeated throughout the war, again and again. Fortified positions fell not simply because walls collapsed, but because confidence collapsed first. Today, many of those bunkers still remain scattered across former battlefields in Europe. Silent concrete structures slowly reclaimed by forests and weather. They stand as reminders that beneath every strategy map and military campaign were young men trapped inside moments of fear, exhaustion, and survival. And sometimes, in the chaos of war, the actions of one determined soldier were enough to make even hardened defenders abandon the walls they trusted most.